Light doesn't erase the dark, it just proves it never had the final say. The softest sunrises often follow the longest nights. Not the showy kind that set the sky on fire, but the kind that creeps in quietly, painting the edges of the world with pale gold while most of the earth is still asleep. These are the sunrises that mean the most. Not because they're loud, but because they arrive anyway, after everything, in spite of everything. That's what healing feels like. It doesn't show up with grand announcements. It doesn't come with the final answer you've been begging for. It simply comes, bit by bit, ray by quiet ray. And you might not even recognize it as healing at first. It might feel like exhaustion, like a shaky breath, like waking up with just enough strength to make coffee and sit in silence without falling apart. If you're carrying pain today, the kind no one else sees, the kind that stays even after you pray, the kind that whispers lies about your worth and your future, I want to begin this with one truth. Your pain is not meaningless. It is not wasted. It is not a punishment. You are not being left behind by God. You are being invited into a deeper place. A place where grace does not require explanations, only surrender, only the tiniest opening in your soul that says, I'm still here. So let's walk slowly. Let's speak softly. Let's go one part at a time. Because healing isn't a sprint. It's a sacred walk in the direction of the light. Let grace sit with you in the dark. We live in a world that rushes pain, that treats sorrow like an inconvenience, that expects you to bounce back, smile through it, keep pushing, and stay positive, even when your heart is barely holding together. But grace doesn't rush, and God never demanded that you run while your soul is still bleeding. What if, just for today, you didn't try to fix it all? What if you let grace sit beside you, not to give answers, but to simply say, I'm here. And you don't have to be okay to be loved, because that's the truth. You don't have to be okay to be loved by God. Your brokenness isn't a threat to Him. It's the very place where He chooses to meet you, not because you're less than, but because you're beloved. Because pain isn't weakness in His eyes. It's an open door. There's a quote I love from Brené Brown that says, grace means that all of your mistakes now serve a purpose instead of serving shame. And if that's true, if grace takes what broke us and repurposes it for healing, then this moment you're in, however hard, is not a void. It's a vessel, a place where something real can grow, a place where silence can teach more than answers ever could, a place where your heart, raw and unsure, is still holy ground. And that's the paradox we don't talk about enough, that pain can be sacred. Not because it feels good, not because we should ever go looking for it, but because God never lets it go unused. If you'll stay with Him in it, if you don't rush past the ache, you might start to see glimmers of something deeper, not a reason for the suffering, but a purpose rising up through it. Psalm 34:18 whispers something tender. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Not the strong-hearted, not the ones who figured it out, the brokenhearted, the crushed, the ones still wiping tears off their faces in the dark, wondering if their faith is still intact. That's where God leans in closest. That's where heaven draws near. And yet, it's easy to feel distant, easy to feel like God must be tired of hearing your prayers, especially when those prayers start sounding the same. When the ache repeats itself, when the healing hasn't come yet. But the absence of resolution is not the absence of God. That's not just a comfort, it's a promise. He's not only present in your victory, He's present in your valley, the long one, the one where nothing makes sense, the one where all you can do is cry, breathe, and try to believe that maybe, just maybe, God's still holding your story together even while it feels like it's falling apart. There's a line in Psalm 35 that says, "Weeping may last through the night, but joy comes with the morning." It doesn't promise a quick fix. It doesn't deny the weeping. It simply acknowledges that both are true: pain and joy, night and morning, brokenness and beauty. And maybe what you need right now is not a map out of the darkness, but a hand to hold while you're in it. Grace is that hand. Not the kind that yanks you forward with force, but the kind that rests gently on your shoulder and reminds you you're not alone, that you're allowed to pause, that you're allowed to feel, that sitting still in sorrow is not the same as giving up. You're not giving up. You're learning how to stay. There's something brave about staying, about not shutting your heart down even when it would be easier to numb out. There's something sacred about showing up to your own pain with honesty, about saying, "I don't have it all together, but I'm not walking away from myself, and I'm not walking away from God." That kind of courage may never go viral. It won't get applause. But in heaven's economy, it matters more than you know. Because God's grace isn't performance-based. It doesn't show up when you finally fix yourself. It moves first. It loves first. It waits with you, even when you're silent, even when you're tired, even when you don't believe you deserve it, especially then. Christine Kane once said, "Sometimes when you're in a dark place, you think you've been buried, but you've actually been planted." That shifts everything. Maybe this isn't the end of your growth. Maybe this is the soil, the rich, dark, quiet soil, where your next season is being formed. You don't have to bloom yet. You don't even have to hope yet. You just have to stay rooted, stay near to grace. Stay where God can speak into the quiet corners of your soul, the places no one else sees, and maybe, just maybe, you'll start to notice that even here, in the dim light, something sacred is taking shape, something steady, something strong, something shaped by mercy, not by pressure. Because that's how God works, not through force, but through faithfulness, not through fixing, but through forming. Let me remind you of Psalm 147:3. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. He doesn't ignore the pain. He binds it, wraps it, tends to it, carefully, patiently, over time. And healing, real healing, isn't about returning to who you used to be. It's about becoming who you were always meant to be, shaped not in spite of the pain, but through it. If you're here today feeling fragile, if the night feels long and the dawn feels far, know this: grace is not in a rush, and neither is God. So let grace sit with you. Let it hold the space while your soul remembers how to breathe. Let it whisper over and over, "You're still being held." And even if you don't believe that yet, let me believe it for you until you do. Because healing is not a destination. It's a daily invitation. And grace is patient enough to wait with you in the dark until light breaks through again. Suffering is not a punishment from God. It is preparation for something deeper. When hardship comes, it's almost instinctive to wonder what went wrong. Pain has a way of whispering false logic, that it must be our fault, that God's silence is proof of his disappointment, that suffering is payback for something unseen. But the God revealed through Scripture doesn't act like that. His love doesn't turn cold when life turns hard. The storms he allows aren't meant to destroy. They are meant to deepen. James once wrote, "Consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." James 1:2-3. Those words don't glamorize pain. They remind us that faith, like gold, is only proven through fire. What burns away is the unnecessary. What remains is what's real. When God allows us to pass through seasons of hardship, He's not punishing us. He's purifying what can't survive where He's taking us next. That idea can feel difficult to accept, especially when the days are long and the nights are filled with unanswered prayers. But what if these very seasons are where heaven does its quietest work? Christine Caine once wrote, "Sometimes when you're in a dark place, you think you've been buried, but you've actually been planted. A planted seed doesn't look alive. It's hidden beneath layers of silence and soil. But in that unseen place, transformation begins. The dark doesn't end its story, it begins it. Perhaps what looks like the end for you is the soil of a new beginning. Growth often starts underground, out of sight, away from applause. No one praises the seed for breaking before it sprouts. Yet that breaking is the moment of life. It's the same with us. There are moments that strip us down to what's essential. The illusions, the control, the pride all fall away. And what remains is the simple, unshakable truth that God is still God and we are still His. Romans 8:28 holds steady through every loss. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him. All things, not only the joyful ones, not only the victories, even the detours, the heartbreaks, the waiting seasons. If we could see from God's perspective, perhaps we would recognize that He is never wasting a single moment of what we endure. What feels like delay may actually be protection. What looks like loss may be a clearing for something truer to grow. Suffering doesn't cancel purpose, it clarifies it. Some of life's hardest seasons are where character gets forged, where you discover that strength isn't about pretending not to hurt, it's about staying tender, even when you do. And that kind of tenderness is what the world needs most. The Apostle Paul knew that paradox well. He wrote, "We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair." 2 Corinthians 4:8. In other words, struggle can coexist with faith. You can be confused and still trust. You can grieve and still believe. The two don't cancel each other. They complete each other. So if you find yourself in the tension between what you prayed for and what has actually come, know that this space is not meaningless. It's where endurance is formed. It's where depth begins. And maybe, just maybe, God is not trying to harden you through suffering, but to soften you, to make room for empathy, for humility, for the kind of wisdom that cannot be taught by comfort. The process hurts because it's holy. When a sculptor begins with stone, the first thing he does is break what's unnecessary. The strikes seem violent, but each one reveals the shape that was always hidden within. Could it be that what feels like loss is actually the carving of something sacred? God's hand doesn't strike to wound, it shapes to reveal. That truth doesn't make pain pleasant, but it gives it meaning. Isaiah 43:2 offers a promise worth holding close. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. Notice the wording. When, not if. Hardship is expected, but abandonment is not. The verse assumes adversity, but guarantees accompaniment. God doesn't promise to remove every fire, but He does promise to walk through it with us. And perhaps that's what maturity in faith really is, not avoiding suffering, but discovering God's nearness inside it. Sometimes the deepest kind of trust begins when every visible reason to trust disappears. That's when the roots reach further down, where water still flows even when the surface looks dry. Suffering doesn't erase God's presence. It often amplifies it in ways that peace never could. There's a line from Joni Eareckson Tada that says, sometimes God allows what he hates to accomplish what he loves. It's honest, even raw. God doesn't delight in pain, but he doesn't waste it either. He can take the very thing meant for harm and turn it into the ground from which mercy grows. So rather than asking, what did I do to deserve this? A better question might be, what might God be developing within me through this? Patience, perhaps, compassion. The ability to comfort others with the comfort you yourself are learning to receive. When you start to see suffering as a classroom instead of a courtroom, everything changes. It's not about punishment. It's about preparation. Preparation for a quieter faith that doesn't depend on circumstances. Preparation for a deeper love that can endure disappointment. Preparation for a heart that mirrors Christ, who himself was acquainted with sorrow and yet overflowed with mercy. The world may not understand this kind of strength. The strength that chooses gentleness, the faith that stands still when it cannot see the road ahead. But heaven calls that kind of endurance holy. And though you may not see it yet, this chapter is chiseling something eternal into your story. When the breakthrough finally comes, and it will, you'll realize that you've changed. You'll find yourself more grounded, more compassionate, more steady than before. Not because the storm didn't touch you, but because it taught you how to stand. Grace doesn't promise a pain-free life. It promises that pain will never be the final word. That's what redemption means, the ability of God to take what was meant for ruin and write it into resurrection. The cross was never a punishment for Christ. It was preparation for glory. And that same pattern echoes in us. The hardest parts of life often become the holiest when seen in hindsight. When you can look back one day and realize that what broke you also built you. That's when you'll understand what Paul meant when he said, our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Romans 8:18. Glory is being revealed, even if you can't yet name it. So hold steady. Let the questions breathe. Let the ache be honest. But don't let the pain convince you that you're being punished. You are still seen, still loved, still in the hands of a Father who does his best work in the dark. The same hands that shaped galaxies are shaping your soul. He's not angry with you. He's not distant. He's not finished. And if today feels like burial, remember, every resurrection begins that way. Even in the dark, your life is still speaking. There are days when everything inside you feels quiet, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that comes after too much, after loss, disappointment, or waiting that has stretched longer than you ever imagined. The kind of quiet where you start to wonder whether your story still matters, whether your prayers still carry weight, whether anything you do in this unseen place is noticed by heaven at all. But what if that quiet isn't emptiness? What if it's depth? What if your voice hasn't disappeared? It's just echoing more deeply through a place that doesn't need applause to prove value. So much of the world measures impact by visibility. If people don't see it, like it, repost it, respond to it, it must not matter. But faith has always moved differently. And some of the most powerful moments in spiritual history were lived out in shadows, not spotlights. You're not forgotten just because you've fallen off the world's radar. In fact, it might be in this very obscurity that your life is saying something truer than ever before. Think of Jesus in the wilderness, 40 days with no crowds, no miracles, no confirmation. Yet it was in that silence that he demonstrated a faith that didn't need performance. His strength didn't rise when people praised him. It rose in private surrender. It rose when the enemy whispered lies and he answered with truth. It rose when the silence could have been mistaken for absence, and yet he stood rooted in identity. That same spirit is still alive in those who keep showing up in the dark, not for attention, but because they trust that God is still working. Scripture reminds us in Galatians 6-9, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." This verse doesn't glamorize pain. It honors endurance. It doesn't say at the visible time, it says at the proper time, meaning timing belongs to God. The harvest may not come when you expect it, but it will come if you refuse to quit in the silent middle. So many people think they need to be loud to make a difference, but think of a candle in a cave. It doesn't shout, yet it changes everything. Not because it's grand, but because it dares to shine in a place that forgot what light felt like. Your courage to keep living with tenderness, to keep offering kindness, to keep being faithful when no one is watching, that is not wasted. That is not background noise. That is not small. It is the heartbeat of hope itself. There's a quote from Frederick Buechner that reads, "Even when we can't see it, our lives are speaking." And maybe the story your life is telling right now isn't about triumph or clarity or resolution. Maybe it's about stillness. Maybe it's about the kind of trust that doesn't announce itself but remains quietly rooted even when the ground feels unstable. The world doesn't always know how to recognize that kind of faith, but heaven calls it holy. You don't have to be writing a book or preaching sermons or crossing off achievements to be meaningful. You are already carrying meaning in the way you forgive what still hurts, in the way you listen when you're the one who needs comfort, in the way you show mercy when judgment would be easier. That's a testimony no stage could ever amplify, but it echoes in eternity. Think about Elijah. After he had poured everything out, he'd faced the prophets of Baal. He'd seen fire fall from heaven, but afterward, he fled into the wilderness, exhausted, unsure, and convinced that he was utterly alone. God didn't come to him in thunder, not in wind, not in fire. God came in a whisper. That's where heaven does its deepest speaking, not through volume, but through intimacy. 1 Kings 19:12 tells us, "After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper." Your life may feel quieter than you expected, but don't mistake that for being silenced. You are still speaking. With every act of resilience, with every gentle choice in a harsh world, with every breath that keeps going despite the pain. We often underestimate the value of simply enduring. But endurance isn't passive. It's not weakness. It's strength, wearing humility. It's love in long form. And its effect stretches further than you know. You might never know whose life you're touching just by showing up. The way you're holding steady through your storm may be exactly what someone else needed to believe they could hold steady through theirs. And that kind of influence can't be measured in numbers, only in eternity. There's another quote I often think about, this one from Henri Nouwen. "The spiritual life is not a life before, after, or beyond our everyday existence. No, the spiritual life can only be real when it is lived in the midst of the pains and joys of the here and now. That means the sacred isn't elsewhere. It's here. It's in the choice to stay honest when it would be easier to pretend. It's in the tears you don't rush, the prayers you whisper under your breath, the trust that holds even when the answers don't. The impact of your life isn't determined by your visibility. It's reflected in the integrity of your unseen moments. It's easy to celebrate strength when it looks victorious, But what about the strength that simply refuses to give up? What about the person who prays quietly in the kitchen, unseen, unheard, but fiercely faithful? What about the mother who keeps loving when she feels empty, the father who shows up when it hurts, the friend who stays through silence, not just celebration? That kind of strength is not small, it's sacred. It's part of the unspoken testimony of people who carry light into dark rooms without waiting to be thanked. When Jesus told his followers, "You are the light of the world," Matthew 5:14, he didn't specify a stage or a crowd or a platform. He spoke to ordinary people, people who'd never be famous, people who'd never be recorded in history books, and yet they carried something holy, a quiet fire of love that could not be extinguished. If you've been wondering whether your presence matters, whether your quiet obedience still carries power, the answer is yes. Even now, especially now, your life is still speaking, and the message it carries may be more needed than ever. Because the world is noisy, fast, distracted, performative. But a life rooted in Christ speaks something different. It reminds others that they don't have to earn value. They already have it. That they don't have to be perfect to be loved. They already are. That they don't have to have everything figured out to be faithful. They just need to keep showing up with honesty. That kind of message can't be silenced by pain. In fact, it often becomes clearer through it. In Romans 5:3-4, Paul writes, "We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope." This isn't a formula, it's a flow. Suffering is not a sign you're off track. It's often part of what forms you to carry a hope that doesn't depend on circumstances. Your consistency, especially in the silence, is proof that your faith isn't built on ease. It's built on something eternal. And that kind of faith has gravity. It draws people in, not through loudness, but through depth. Not because it's flawless, but because it's real. Not because it answers every question, but because it holds space for the ones that are still unresolved. Your scars, though hidden, carry stories. Not of shame, but of survival. Not of defeat, but of deliverance. Someone else may one day find comfort in the very place where you felt most alone. That's how God redeems the dark, not always by removing it, but by making it the backdrop for light that endures. And maybe that's why your story still matters, even now, especially now. Because it reminds others that they're not alone in their questions. That doubt doesn't cancel faith. That quiet doesn't mean absence. That the silence between answered prayers can still hold sacred conversation. Don't let the lack of noise convince you your life isn't echoing. Don't let the absence of applause convince you your offering doesn't matter. Heaven hears what the world overlooks, and what you're living, the struggle, the small acts of grace, the refusal to turn cold, is testifying to the goodness of God in a world desperate to believe goodness still exists. There will be days when you wonder if it's worth it. Days when you'll be tempted to close off, to retreat, to withhold. But the light you carry, even if it flickers, still carries warmth. And warmth changes things. Keep going. Not for perfection, not for recognition, but for the quiet revolution that happens when someone chooses faithfulness over fame, gentleness over rage, depth over display. Your life, even in the dark, is still declaring something beautiful, and the heavens are listening. It is in the silence of the soul that God speaks the loudest. Sometimes what we call silence is really sacred space. It isn't empty, it's focused. The absence of noise doesn't mean God has gone quiet on purpose. It often means he's inviting you into something deeper than words, and that kind of invitation rarely comes with a headline. There's a stillness that only appears when everything you've leaned on no longer holds you, when the routines fail, when the results stop coming, when all the people you thought would stay have gone quiet. That's often the threshold of something more honest. In that space, the performance fades, the pretending slips away. And what remains is real. No titles, no need to impress, just you and God. There's something humbling about that kind of encounter, and maybe that's why we avoid silence so often, not because we dislike the quiet, but because we're afraid of what it might reveal. We want reassurance, but we fear what will rise when the distractions fall. But if we never let the noise fade, we might never hear the kind of voice that heals. Psalm 46:10 offers a rare command in a world that never stops moving: be still and know that I am God. It's not a suggestion to pause temporarily. It's a spiritual necessity. Stillness isn't weakness, it's surrender, and in that surrender, something begins to shift. God rarely speaks through chaos. He doesn't rush revelation. He speaks at the speed of trust, not urgency. If your life feels suspended, like it's waiting for something to move, that doesn't mean it's stalled. It might mean heaven is opening the kind of conversation that doesn't begin until everything else gets quiet. We're often taught to associate progress with activity. But in the spiritual life, depth is often born in stillness. Not everything that's happening can be seen on the surface. 1 Kings 19:12 tells the story of Elijah in crisis, alone, depleted, and unsure of what God would do next. The wind howled, the earth shook, fire passed by, but God wasn't in the spectacle. He arrived in a whisper. And it was in that whisper that Elijah found the clarity his soul was starving for. That's the paradox. When God draws near in silence, He's not ignoring you. He's respecting your vulnerability. He isn't withholding answers. He's providing presence. There's a different kind of conversation happening in these moments, one that doesn't rely on noise. You might not get a message in words, but you begin to notice peace where anxiety once lived. You begin to feel held in places that used to unravel you. And you realize that God hasn't stepped away. He's stepped in. Barbara Brown Taylor once said, "The quietness required to hear God's voice is hard to find, but harder to ignore once it arrives." That kind of silence doesn't fade when the world gets loud again. It leaves an imprint. It rewrites how you measure clarity. In those still places, you don't need to push for outcomes. You begin to value the process. The lack of immediate resolution doesn't feel like a threat. It feels like an open field where something gentle is finally allowed to grow. This is where patience isn't forced, it's welcomed. Where presence no longer needs to prove itself through miracles, where God's nearness becomes the miracle. Even when questions remain, something in you starts to steady. You no longer measure progress by movement. You begin to trust formation in the unseen. Isaiah 30:15 reminds us of this quiet strength. In quietness and trust is your strength. The power God gives in stillness is not loud, but it is unshakable. It doesn't need to convince anyone. It simply holds. That kind of trust begins to bloom slowly. Sometimes it begins when you realize you don't have to be the one holding everything together. And strangely, the silence that once felt threatening begins to feel like shelter. Your soul recognizes that no amount of striving could offer this kind of clarity. You begin to sit longer with questions, not because they've been answered, but because you're no longer afraid of what they mean. You start to welcome solitude, not as exile, but as invitation. And in that environment, your heart becomes tender in a way it hasn't been for years. Not fragile, just open. A different kind of strength emerges, not based on confidence in yourself, but in the quiet conviction that God is enough, even when life is not. This is where the spiritual life deepens. Not in spectacular events, but in subtle shifts. Not in fire and wind, but in the soft realization that you are not alone and haven't been for a single second. Thomas Merton once wrote, "God speaks in the silence of the heart, and we listen." He didn't say God explains, he said God speaks. And that speech may not follow our preferred patterns. It may look like a deep rest, a moment of stillness, a breath that doesn't carry words, but carries awareness. In those quiet places, the need to impress disappears. You're no longer striving to earn grace. You're simply letting yourself be loved. That love doesn't need volume to reach you. It's already there, embedded into every breath you take in surrender. The longer you stay in that quiet, the more you begin to change. Not because you've figured everything out, but because you've stopped forcing answers. Faith doesn't always look like clarity. Sometimes it looks like continuing, even when nothing has shifted yet. And that continuation becomes a declaration. God is still enough for me, even here. You're not waiting for the silence to end. You're learning to live with God inside of it. This isn't wasted time. The soul doesn't grow by rushing. It grows by abiding. And in that abiding, you start to remember that stillness isn't failure. It's a different kind of fullness. A fullness the world doesn't recognize, but heaven celebrates. The transformation doesn't shout. It doesn't perform. But it runs deep. It realigns your desires. It reshapes your prayers. It builds trust that doesn't shatter when the next storm hits. And when you rise again, because you will, the strength you carry won't come from answers. It will come from having walked with God long enough to know His voice, even when He speaks without words. That voice doesn't always offer direction. Sometimes it just offers presence. And presence, when it's divine, is more than enough. Morning always comes, so rest in His mercy. Tonight. Some nights are longer than others. Not because the hours stretch, but because the weight does. And when sleep doesn't come easy, it's not always the noise outside that keeps you awake. It's what echoes inside, thoughts that won't quiet, questions without closure, memories that return without permission. There are seasons when the night doesn't just describe time, it describes the soul. And in those seasons, even hope feels heavy. But Scripture speaks gently into the ache. Weeping may last through the night, but joy comes with the morning. Psalm 35. It doesn't minimize the night. It doesn't rush it. It simply places a promise inside it that this isn't the end of the story, that something is coming. That light still knows the way forward, even if you can't feel it yet. You might be holding on to faith by a thread right now, and that thread, though thin, still ties you to a truth that doesn't unravel with time. God doesn't abandon those He loves in the dark. He walks them through it. Maybe you've whispered your last prayer of the day and still felt no change. Maybe the silence seems louder than your faith, but faith doesn't always roar. Sometimes it settles in as the courage to lie down, even with questions. Sometimes it's trusting that rest is not giving up. It's giving back to God what you were never meant to carry alone. Tonight doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be surrendered. There's mercy built into the dark, but it's quiet. It won't demand attention. It arrives like breath, unseen, constant, necessary. And once you notice it, you realize it's been here longer than your exhaustion. Not as a reward for getting it right, but as a companion when everything feels wrong. Lamentations 3:22-23 reminds us, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. That means tomorrow isn't just another page on the calendar. It's a declaration, a new beginning that doesn't rely on how well you perform today. The mercy coming with the morning isn't earned, it's gifted. And the kind of mercy God gives doesn't just patch you up so you can push harder. It meets you in your fatigue and says, rest here, I'll hold what you can. You don't have to have it all resolved before the morning. You don't need to have the answers tonight. That pressure to fix, to explain, to control, you can set it down. The God who holds galaxies does not require your perfection to offer peace. His mercy isn't delayed, it's waiting. You've done what you could. You showed up. You kept going. You tried your best with what you had. And if that feels insufficient, grace has always made up the difference. Not once has your weakness disqualified you from rest. There's something sacred about the way God weaves peace into fatigue. You don't always notice the shift, but one moment, you're holding everything together. And the next, you're being held. Not because the situation changed, but because your posture did. Surrender doesn't mean you failed. It means you're wise enough to know that control was never the point. Trust is. And trust says, even if I don't know what's next, I believe God is already there. Rest begins there. Not in knowing how the future will unfold, but in knowing who holds it. A soul can breathe again in that space, not because everything is light, but because the darkness doesn't own the final word. The night will pass. It always does. The rhythm of creation itself teaches us that. Darkness is real, but it is never permanent. The sun may not rise with trumpets, but it rises slowly, faithfully. And you're allowed to wait for it without guilt. Your worth doesn't depend on how quickly you recover. You don't have to outrun your grief, your confusion, your process. What's unfinished in you doesn't scare God. He isn't pacing the floor of heaven, waiting for you to pull yourself together. He's beside you, speaking in silence, offering rest even while your soul still trembles. Jesus knew the weight of night. He felt it in Gethsemane, alone, agonizing, surrendered. He didn't skip the suffering. He didn't rush through the human ache. And yet, even in that moment, mercy was preparing the morning. If he could rest in the middle of darkness, not because it was easy, but because the Father was still present, then so can we. The same God who sat with him in the garden sits with you now. You don't need to pretend it's easy. You don't have to pretend at all. He sees what no one else does. The private battles, the internal storms, the weariness behind your smile. And his response is never, try harder. It's always, come to me and I will give you rest. Not vague peace, not surface level reassurance, rest. Real, soul-deep restoration. Matthew 11:28 puts it simply, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. That's not a metaphor. That's a promise. And tonight, it's still true. So whatever's been weighing you down, whatever didn't get fixed, whatever still hurts, you're not carrying it alone. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever. Let yourself lean into that truth. Let go of what's not yours to fix. Let yourself breathe without answers. Let your heart return to the quiet knowledge that being held is more important than being strong. You're safe here, even in the uncertainty, even in the unanswered places, because love doesn't require certainty. It just needs honesty. And if all you can bring tonight is a whisper of hope, a flicker of belief, that's enough. God doesn't ask for perfect trust. He simply asks you not to shut the door on him while you're waiting. Mercy always finds its way in through the cracks, and it will find you here. Not because you summoned it, but because that's who God is. He comes close when the world pulls away. He stays through the long dark, and when you wake again, he will still be here. If you've made it this far, I hope you've heard what your heart needed most. Your suffering is not meaningless. It is not wasted. And it is not where the story ends. Even in silence, even in the stretch of waiting, even in the dark, God is still near. He's not testing your worth. He's building your depth. He's not walking ahead of you demanding more. He's walking with you, step by sacred step, whispering mercy into every heavy place. So take one last breath tonight, not with fear, but with faith. You don't need to know what happens next. You just need to know this. Morning always comes. And when it does, it brings the kind of light no darkness can erase. God is not done with you. And this quiet, unfinished, holy part of the journey still matters.